welcome everyone to, I think this is our last CCSE Distinguished Seminar of the fall semester. And very pleased to have Professor Benjamin Peherstorfer from the Courant Institute for Mathematical Sciences in New York. So Ben is familiar to Boston because he did his PhD at TU Munich and then actually spent a couple of years here at MIT as a postdoctoral associate in Aeroastro working with Karen Wilcox. And then spent 2 years in Madison before joining Courant in 2018. And Ben has done a whole host of interesting things in multi-fidelity modeling, reduced order modeling, sparse grids, learning dynamical systems, and scientific machine learning now kind of writ broadly. And along the way has won essentially all the awards that one can win, the NSF Career Award, the DOE Early Career Award, the AFOSR Young Investigator Award, and in recognition of all the neat things he's been doing. And yeah, so Ben is here today, is going to tell us about leveraging nonlinear dynamics of high-dimensional systems for data-driven prediction. So Ben, please take it away.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Yusuf, and thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to present some of our research here today. So I will talk about nonlinear latent dynamics, and I will try to convince you that it is beneficial to leverage them, even when they are not that clear how to use them in some of the more challenging systems. So I would like to introduce you some of the team members that have worked very hard on the things that I'm going to present. There's Jules Behrman, who is a PhD student in my group, and Tobias Blicken, who is a postdoc, and they have collaborated extensively on the later part that I will present on stochastic model reduction. There are Yifan Shen and Huan Zhang, who have worked on more on the theory parts that I will only briefly touch on today. And then Paul and Yuk Xiao have worked on various topics that are spread out through the presentation. So let me start with showing this video of an eagle that is trying to land on a rock. And you can see that the eagle gets hit by wind gusts and he has a hard time steering and controlling with his wings so that he works against these wind gusts. There's a harsh environment. And only in the second attempt, he really manages to land on that rock softly and in a very gentle way. And I think we all agree that this eagle is not solving 3D Navier-Stokes highly resolved with a turbulence model and has a control loop around that with uncertain environmental conditions to solve this really challenging task that he's trying to solve. But he uses some kind of latent dynamics, implicitly, of course, latent information that allows him to solve this really challenging task in this harsh environment without having to do this really expensive direct calculations. And in some sense, this is the motivation for leveraging latent dynamics. We see latent dynamics in many systems that are out there, and especially in computational science and engineering, leveraging latent dynamics can help us to make tractable outer-loop applications. So whenever you have an application that requires to simulate your model or to make a numerical simulation many times in a row for different inputs, different parameters, different coefficients, then leveraging latent dynamics, finding reduced models can be really helpful, not only to speed this up, but to actually make it tractable at all. This corresponds to uncertainty quantification, control, optimal design, inverse problems, and so on. But latent dynamics are also really important when we want to learn models from data, because it's very difficult to learn a comprehensive model that is predictive in all possible scenarios. So there's often a manifold assumption that really allows us to tractably learn from a limited amount of data. This could be in non-intrusive model reductions, could be in operator learning and some other kind of learning paradigms. And then in other settings, we might have even such large numerical simulations that we cannot perform them in a monolithic way. We have to decompose the system, simulate subsystems, couple them together as well, and this can be useful. Reduced modeling can be useful for that as well. So this is just a motivation that I think I'm excited about latent dynamics. I think it's important to look at them, and this is just a list of things where they can be useful in a CSE context. Now let me be a little bit more formal. What I will look at in the following are evolution equations. So my pointer doesn't show up here in this very bright screen. I try to stretch here. So we have an evolution equation of this type. I don't really make strong assumptions at this point about that evolution equation. We have a solution function Q that depends on time and the spatial coordinate X. And then we have a generic right-hand side F that can contain partial derivatives of this Q function. And formally, we can think of collecting solutions of that equation in a set curly M. It's sometimes referred to as the solution manifold, even though it doesn't necessarily have to have a manifold structure, which are these functions Q at specific points in time over time range as functions of the spatial coordinates. And now this set curly M is often a subset of some finite dimensional approximation space, a finite element space, for example, finite volumes. And this is this capital N dimensional space curly V. Now what we are aiming to do when we say we want to leverage or learn or use latent dynamics is to find structure in this set M and use it to make quicker predictions about, approximate quicker predictions about the solution of this system. So the first thing that comes to your mind is to try to find a subspace or to find a low dimensional space curly V little n that has much lower dimension than capital N, and to use that to approximate the elements of M. Empirically, one could apply the singular value decomposition to a snapshot matrix. So evaluating the solution function over time and spatial coordinates and over time, and taking the SVD and taking the first few left singular vectors that span the best approximating space of this data in some norm that has been used to compute the SVD. So this is the classical setup of model reduction, right? In a training phase, one constructs this little n-dimensional subspace that with the motivation to well approximate the elements of that curly M. And then in an evaluation or an online phase that one repeats many times in a row, one tries to find a reduced solution Q tilde in this lower dimensional subspace curly V little n that has much smaller dimension than the original high dimensional space. And that is where one can potentially gain speed up, so make computations tractable at all. And these kind of things have been developed by many groups, and there are 2 survey papers listed here. So if we take now this very classical setting, trying to find these low dimensional subspaces, and we apply it to something like the heat equation in 1D. So this is the spatial domain, one-dimensional spatial domain. This is the time domain. And I'm showing you the solution of the heat equation. It's a diffusive problem, and I collect snapshots, and I plot the singular values. We get a decay that looks like this. So you can see that maybe with 22, 23 modes, I can explain the snapshot data down to double precision. I used, I think, 256 grid points to discretize this scheme. So there's a huge reduction in the dimension and this 22-dimensional space is sufficient to approximate the data that I have down to double precision. So that's great. And these are problems where these classical methods work really well. These diffusion-dominated problems where these classical methods work really well. But if you look at another prototypical example, for example, the linear advection equation, which is transport, and we start with an initial condition that's a Gaussian bump, then the only thing that this linear advection equation is doing, it transports that Gaussian bump from left to right in the spatial domain. And if we now collect snapshots, we get a very different decay of the singular values. And you can see they not only decay much slower, they decay even with a different rate, right? Exponential versus an algebraic rate. And this is just a reminder that it's really important to make sure that we have methods that use and learn and leverage latent dynamics that are tied to the problems that we're interested in. There's not one fits all method for using latent dynamics. And I'm interested in these kind of problems where it's a little bit more challenging than just using subspaces to leverage the latent dynamics. This more broadly, these transport-dominated problems where there's for example, strongly convecting flows, where there's a wave-like structure traveling through the spatial domain. Those kind of problems we know cannot be well reduced with subspace-based methods, and I will discuss that in more detail in a second. But there are many other problems where latent dynamics are not that obvious that we just can find some subspaces, for example, cortex systems that are not meaningful in a pointwise way, or similar stochastic systems where, again, a single sample trajectory is often not that meaningful. And I'm interested in these kind of problems and trying to understand how we can find reduced models for these problems. And this brings me to the outline now of my presentation. I will first talk about what we refer to as Neural Galerkin schemes that help us to tackle these transport-dominated problems and find reduced models for them. And then in the second part, I will talk about how to reduce stochastic systems, or one way to do this, where we are aiming to learn vector fields of the corresponding population dynamics. Okay, let me start with Neural Galerkin schemes for transport-dominated problems. And for that, I would like to dive a little bit deeper why these transport-dominated problems are hard to reduce for subspace-based methods. So let's again look at the linear advection equation, just as an analytic example. time derivative, spatial derivative. The initial condition, it's a specific setup. The initial condition is just a step function that then gets transported from left to right by this linear advection equation. We can look then at our set curly M of solutions over some time range. And then we can ask the question, well, maybe the SVD that I applied in this numerical 2 example earlier just didn't give us a good subspace. Maybe there's another subspace that can well approximate these kind of problems. So we can ask the question, what is the best we can do by using a low dimensional subspace of dimension little n? And this is given by the Kolmogorov n width, at least formally, which gives us the best worst case error that one can achieve with a little n dimensional subspace. Now this is a quantity that's very formal. It's hard to give it a specific number, so we want to bound it. Yes.
From a dynamical system perspective, are we trying to, with an application of this DN, is it to find an isolating integral of the evolution?
No, I'm not even thinking of dynamical systems here. You can just say you have a set of elements and you would like to approximate them in a subspace. There are no dynamics at this point. They are coming from an evolution equation in our case, but they don't have to. All right, any other comments? Okay. All right, so what can we say about that n width, that specific version of the n width? And it has been shown that for this setup, by Olberg and Raab in 2016, and then for the wave equation by Greif and Uben in 2020, that this n width cannot decay faster than 1 over square root n. So this tells us that there cannot exist a sequence of subspaces with increasing dimension n that achieve a faster error decay than 1 over square root n. And 1 over square root n is, of course, a very slow decay for numerical analysis, right? We would like to see exponential error decays. That's what we like in numerical analysis. For Monte Carlo, 1 over square root n, yeah, one has to live with it. But for numerical analysis, this 1 over square root n is really slow. And this is a hard bound, and this is sometimes referred to as the Kolmogorov barrier of subspace-based methods for reducing this kind of transport.
Is the reason, sort of the underlying qualitative reason for that 1 over square root of n, that essentially this is a random walk in subspace? You're you're not, as you increase the dimension of your subspace, you're not actually doing this with any criterion. It's just like you're just adding more, right?
But this gives you the best possible case. So there can be a space that is tuned to your curly M. So the proof, how the proof works, is that from these step functions, you try to find orthogonal functions, and you will see that you have then that you can find as many orthogonal functions, and that the error only can decrease with this 1 over square root n as you increase the dimension. You can go from square root n to 1 over n and things like this if you smooth the step. This is where the square root is coming from. It's the worst, the step is the worst possible.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we want to overcome that. And we know that these linear type methods are affected by it. So let me just briefly recap that what I mean with linear in the following is that one constructs a space, curly little n, that is spanned by these n basis functions phi. And then the reduced solution has this form, this linear combination, Q tilde is the reduced solution, linear combination of the betas times the phis. And if we write this a little bit more in a machine learning style, where the beta is the parameter or the weight that we allow to tune to approximate our element Q, then you can immediately see this is a linear approximation. It's a kernel type approximation where you have your basis matrix here and your coefficient here. And any reduced model reduction method that uses these kind of approximations is affected by this Kolmogorov barrier. Now, to get around it, we have to do something nonlinear. And what I mean by nonlinear in the following, that I'm allowed to adapt the representation, the phi 1 to phi little n, based on the element I'd like to approximate. So this is kind of the other way around than in the linear case. In the linear case, one constructs one space and all elements are approximated in that space. Now we turn this around and say, give me one element and I'm allowed to change the representation. Doesn't have to be a basis anymore, a subspace. Change the representation that I can well approximate that Q. And to make that meaningful, we have to, of course, restrict this a little bit, and it's typically done with features so that one has an alpha vector a finite dimensional one, where now we have this alpha vector that is allowed to enter non-linearly here in this phi to change the phi based on the element we would like to approximate. And these kind of parameterizations, everyone is extremely familiar with those because this is exactly what deep neural networks are doing. So for these transport-dominated problems, we know something like deep networks are the right tool because they allow you, with adapting the inner layers, allow you to change the representation. Now, but before the not so recent rise anymore of neural networks, there has been lots of other works on nonlinear parameterizations in that context. For example, localized model reduction methods, where one pre-computes a finite number of alpha vectors and then uses one of them based on some criteria. They're also called dictionary approaches in many other fields. Yes?
Should I think about this decomposition as an expansion of in my Koopman modes, or like a linear embedding like this?
Of course, if you do infinite dimensional, things become linear and you might connect it, but for now, I don't see a connection to Koopman at this point. Okay. So localized and dictionary approaches, online adaptive model reduction, where one still maintains a space of some sort, but adapts it with time. And here I want to mention the work on dynamic low-rank approximations by Koch and Lubick, and also by Themis Sapsis and Pierre Lemercier on dynamic orthogonal decompositions, and many other works in these directions. And then this whole idea of nonlinear maps and trying to recover a linear structure by applying a nonlinear transformation, for example, where lots of stuff has been done in that area as well. Now, what we are trying to do, how we are trying to overcome the Kolmogorov barrier is a little bit different, but of course related to these other things. What we are saying is that we would like to use a neural network or some other nonlinear parameterization, but I will refer to the parameters just as weights, where the weights depend on time. So now my theta is the weight of my nonlinear parameterization, and it depends on time, and it corresponds to the alpha and the beta that we have seen on the previous slide. But I don't need to distinguish between alpha and beta moving forward. So my nonlinear approximation, Q tilde, has now this form here, where there's a weight vector theta that we allow to enter non-linearly, that depends on time, and it is a function of over the spatial coordinate x. But time does not enter as an input. This is a key thing. Time only enters through the network weights. This means if we now would like to follow the solution of our evolution equation, we cannot just evaluate the network at a new point in time. We have to update the weights. We have to change the weights of the network. And for this, we need to impose dynamics on the theta. We need to impose how can we move forward the theta such that in some sense we solve our problem. And the tool that we use for that is the Dirac-Frankel variational principle, which has been around for a long time, at least the 1930s. For me, very influential was the work by Lubick and collaborators who put this in very modern terms. But of course, there's lots of work in this direction. So let me just very briefly summarize what we achieved by that before diving into the details how we get these dynamics right. So by allowing the theta to enter non-linearly, we can circumvent the Kolmogorov barrier. That's fine. That's kind of our motivation. We have that the parameter changes with time, which means we do not have a time-space approximation. I do not need my network to capture the whole thing over time and space. I only need to capture it locally in time. This will allow us to get away with tiny networks compared to time-space approximations. And finally, I'm not finding this theta by throwing a big optimization problem at lots of training data, but I'm actually using the PDE to enforce or impose an ODE or a dynamical system on this theta t that tells me how to move them forward in time. So that on this manifold of possible functions that my network can give me, I move over time to get my approximations of the solution. Okay. Now, how do we impose these dynamics? And this, as I said, is the Dirac-Frankel variational principle. So let me touch on that briefly. And for that, let's forget the time dependence just for a second. And let's say we have a nonlinear parameterization with p many weights, theta 1 to theta p. And Q tilde, I can wiggle now the theta and reach any function on this bluish set here. So this is this here. All the functions in this set I can reach by changing the theta. And then I can take one point. I can take the point q tilde at some theta, and I can look at least formally on the tangent space. Again, doesn't have to have manifold structure, then it's just a space, but you can think of it as a tangent space that is spanned by the partial derivatives of the q tilde, so our parametrization with respect to these p parameters, these p weights of our network. And now let's bring in back time. So we have our theta that depends on time. I want to compute a time derivative. Time only enters through the weight theta. So I need to apply the chain rule. And what I get is the gradient of this q tilde times theta dot, which is the time derivative of the weights. And what this tells me is now that this time derivative has to lie in that space, because the component functions of this gradient are exactly these functions that span this space. Okay, so equipped with this, we can bring back our PDE that looks like this. We take our q tilde, we plug it into the PDE, and we get a residual in theta and theta dot. So we have here our time derivative and minus our right-hand side evaluated our q tilde at our q tilde. We already know this time derivative of q tilde is the gradient times the theta dot. Now, I won't be able to, in general, to set this residual to 0 by changing my theta and theta dot. But to close the equation, what the Dirac-Frankel variational principle tells us to do is to project the right-hand side onto that tangent space. So to have a projection here that brings my right-hand side onto that gray space, and then I can have equality here. Then I have a closed equation. Okay, so the f is projected on that, and that gives me an equation in theta and theta dot that I can solve. Now, a different angle to look at this, and this was our original motivation, that's why we refer to these sometimes as Neural Galerkin schemes, is that you can simply say, I want my residual to be orthogonal with respect to this tangent space as a test space, and these orthogonality conditions on the residual give you the same dynamics. So there are multiple perspectives on how to get these same theta dot dynamics. Okay, great. So what we have achieved with that is that we obtain now a dynamical system for the thetas. So for the weights of our network, how they have to change over time, such that the network function in this variational sense, for example, this Galerkin conditions that I described, solves the PDE numerically. And one could now directly solve this system with a time integration scheme, discretize it in time, apply a time integration scheme, and then one gets neural network weights over these time steps that then correspond to the corresponding function. And it should remind you of something that's very common in numerical analysis, where one first discretizes the spatial domain, one gets a system of ODEs, one integrates forward that system of ODEs in time, and so gets the numerical solution. It's very similar here, except that we have this nonlinear parameterization, so we cannot directly use what has been very standard in the numerical analysis literature. Okay, now the other thing is that we should not directly solve this dynamical system, because these are the normal equations to a least squares problem that looks like this, where we minimize over the theta dot, such that the theta dot times the gradient best approximates our f. This is exactly this projection condition that I mentioned earlier. So what we numerically want to solve is the least squares problem, of course, because it's better conditioned than the normal equations. And this least squares problem is really interesting in my opinion. First, it is linear in the theta dot. It's linear in the unknown. So we use a potentially very nonlinear parameterization, but what we get are linear least squares problems. But of course, the catch is that it's not one linear least squares problem, but a time continuous linear least squares problem. We can preserve that linearity with explicit time integration. And at each point in time, you have to solve a linear least squares problem, which are then the costs of the time step in these schemes. And you can add constraints. You can conserve mass, momentum, Hamiltonians exactly. So this is not penalty or something. It really, you can bake it in. Okay, so there's a lot of structure in these linear least squares problems here, and corresponding, they have been around in various flavors in many different settings. So I mentioned already the work by Lubich. I already mentioned the work by Themis and Pierre Lemercier. There's work on Black and Unger where they update modes, similar to the dynamic orthogonal decomposition. There's work by Duan, Saki, and Anderson who do this in kind of network nonlinear parameterization type things as well. So I'm not claiming we are the first who have written down this dynamics, but we are looking at it in the perspective of these neural solutions, and especially in the context of latent dynamics. All right. Now, what can we say about the error of these schemes, right? To get a little bit a feeling for what determines the error when we solve in those. And what really controls the error is the projection of the F onto the tangent space. And this is, let's say we have an epsilon that upper bounds the projection of F onto the tangent space, the error that we make by that. Then under standard assumptions on the corresponding systems, one can show that the error, the error of the approximation Q tilde with respect to Q is upper bounded by the accumulation of these projection errors. So it really means we have to be very careful that we can accurately project the right-hand side onto the tangent space. This is really key, and it's a bit surprising because it doesn't really say we need to approximate our solution well or something. It's really about this projection that we have to get very right. And we look, yes.
Sorry, is the reason why we have a constant C the fact that our system, like the system in which we are projected on, are time independent, or is it another reason that?
Yeah, it's a time independent F, and you get this F then from Lipschitz type.
Okay.
Approximations. Yes, very standard stuff. Okay. All right, and we have looked into this quite a bit. So these kind of results have been floating around, and we looked into this quite a bit recently in a preprint where we tried to understand how we can avoid that the projection error goes up over time. We refer to this as the tangent space collapse. And we worked on this, and you can do various versions on optimize and discretize. There's a discretize and optimize one. I don't go into details of that here, but if you're interested in this, this paper could be a first step. In general, these kind of schemes that I described are really a stepping stone for us now on to various things. We did randomized versions that help us to regularize these least squares problems and get speedups at the same time. I'm really excited about this paper here, and we're backing it up with much more theory at the moment. We have looked at high dimensional problems where the main issue is that you have to estimate the loss of this least squares problem, which is not completely obvious to do in high dimensions. And in this paper, we couple the dynamics of theta with dynamics of samples so that we move forward both together and can efficiently estimate the corresponding loss function. We have worked on conserving quantities in this area, and we have worked on the model reduction side on pre-training networks now, so that we have a very small latent dimension in which we need to apply these Neural Galerkin schemes. And this is what I want to touch on a little bit more to connect it back to this challenge of the Kolmogorov barrier that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so now we have a PDE that's not only depending on time, but also on a physics parameter mu. So this could be something like Reynolds number or heat conductivity coefficient or some other quantity you would like to generalize over in an outer loop application. And then what we would like to do is that our parameters now, our weights, depend not only on time, but also on this physics parameter mu. So we need to generalize over time and mu now. And what we would like to do is that we split this weight vector into, on the one hand, offline weights that are independent of T and mu, on which we can pre-train one-time large-scale computations, high costs, and some snapshot data. And then we have a tiny number of online weights that depend on T and mu, for which we use Neural Galerkin to move them forward in time based on the dynamics of the PD. So this dimension R of the online weight should be much smaller than the dimension P of these offline weights. And the key question is, how do we split up the network into this offline and this online weights? And for that, let's just look at the fully connected feed-forward network for a second, but the same principle applies to more interesting network architectures as well. So our Q tilde is now a feed-forward network with L layers CL, and the sigma is the activation function. And the standard layer would be just this affine transformation. So C of X is WX plus B, where W is some weight matrix. Now, the motivation for us is LoRa, low rank layers that have been very popular and are still very popular, I would say, in large language models, where people try to fine-tune the large language model to specific tasks. So they have LoRa layers with W and B again, but additionally these low rank matrices A, B, and then they fine tune the AB of the large language model to a specific task, maybe 5 tasks or something like this. But this is not enough for us. We need to continuously update the weights, right? And this is why we introduced CoLoRA, continuous low rank adaptation, where we have the W, we have the A and the B and the little b, and we have additionally this alpha vector, or just a scalar that allows us to modulate the A-B update. So what we then get are offline weights, these W's, so from the first layer, the A-B from the first layer, and so on. It's a huge number of weights. And then online, we have a tiny number of weights, which are these alphas. And in fact, in all the numerical experiments that I'm going to show, the alpha per layer is just a scalar. So just a scalar per layer is sufficient to adapt the weights based on the dynamics that we need for our PD solution. Okay, and this is this ICML paper from this summer, actually. Okay, now let's say we have trained offline these weights, and now we would like over some parameters, for specific problems, and now we would like to apply it to this rotating detonation waves problem, right? I'm skipping over the tuning of the offline weights. It's just a standard least squares regression on the offline weights. There's really no tricky part there. So let me go through that example now, which is transport dominated. There are waves circling in this angular domain. This is motivated by rotating detonation engines, but of course we look at a very simplified model for that. So I don't even want to refer to it as rotating detonation engines, but just rotating detonation waves. And these are quite complicated wave dynamics because you start with a detonation, which is a shock, and then it smooths out and it starts to circulate. And at some point in time, there could be another wave starting to appear. And then they have to get in some distance from each other, distance pi, maximum distance from each other. So quite complicated wave dynamics. And with standard model reduction in subspaces, you can imagine these waves introduce a lot of transport, and therefore the reduction is quite difficult for subspace-based methods. And here how the dynamics look like. So we have the intensity of the fluid, we have the combustion progress, we have the injection term over different times 0 up to times 45. You can see here that detonation, and then the shock appears, it gets a bit smoothed out, and after a while there are then 2 waves that circulate. But it's quite a long time approximation. Okay. Now let's apply this CoLoRA Neural Galerkin machinery to this, and we just use 4 dimensions as the latent dimension. And for this RDE problem, this is the relative L2 error of the states. We get about 10 to the minus 3 on our reduced model, versus linear same dimension is about 10 to the minus 1, so about 2 orders of magnitudes better. This is fine. One can always compress in some sense quite easily. What's hard is to maintain speed up, to get really speed up. And with that method, because we have such a low latent dimension that we apply the Neural Galerkin on, we get a speed up of about 100 or 182 compared to the full model, to the numerical model. Now, this is just one example. We apply this, of course, to many other different examples, Burger's equations, Vlasov type problems, and it's kind of consistent that we get these errors of 10 to the minus 3 with speed ups between 100 and 200 and maybe a little bit more here and there. So there is we can reduce these transport dominated problems to some extent, and we get speed ups in these cases. Yes.
Is there a heuristic why the speed up on Vlasov is not as spectacular as the speed up on RD?
Yes, the reason is that for Vlasov you use explicit time integration, and therefore the time step is very cheap.
And what kind of problem were you doing on the Vlasov case?
I will come back to the Vlasov a little bit more detail. I know it's careful to just write Vlasov here. This is a very simple Vlasov with a fixed potential.
Okay.
Okay. All right. This is toy examples, and I try at least to also work with more serious people and more serious applications. We have done these kind of things of nonlinear approximations in various ways in the past, especially as part of a center of excellence on reduced modeling of rocket combustion dynamics that was led out of U Michigan. And they observed, this was with the Air Force Research Labs, and they observed these pressure waves traveling through this combustion chamber. And this is exactly what introduced the Kolmogorov barrier for these kind of problems. So what we did is all kinds of versions of nonlinear approximations. We started with 1D combustion models where we could predict the pressure oscillations over different heat release parameters and get speedups. Then we did a 2D version of a mixing layer. And this were the point then where the engineers actually got interested in things. And they have picked up on this method and now really applied it to more serious applications that they're actually interested in. So single injector rocket combustors. Again, this is not my work. This is work from out of this center, where they are excited about these kind of things because it needs way little training data than, say, an operator learning model. Generating trajectories here can take months of compute time, and you cannot simply generate 100 trajectories or something like this. And with these kind of reduced modeling things, you can get away with less data. And you also applied it to the real models that they use for this rotating detonation engine. So just to show you, we are not stopping at burgers and these simple 1D problems, but we really try to collaborate and bring some of these methods to some more interesting applications as well. All right. That was the first part on these transport-dominated problems and one way how we can tackle them. So let me now move to the second part, which is changing gears a little bit. We have now stochastic systems, and we would like to learn them. So we don't even have equations anymore. We just have data sets in this case now. So the setup is that I think of having a stochastic process, X, that depends on time, of course, but also again on the physics parameter, right? This is always the thing that we want to generalize over. We want to predict over these different physics parameters. It's a d-dimensional state space. And what we can observe are realizations of trajectories. So this is the ith realization over time t1, t2 up to the final time for 1 mu. And we have a data set now. We don't have the equation anymore. It's different from the previous setting. We just have the data set of these realizations of nx realizations over nt time steps over n mu different mu's. And what we want to do is we would like to learn a model that can predict the behavior, and of course this is fuzzy, and I will make it more precise in a second, of the stochastic process that new parameters make. So the one standard way to do this is to assume there's a nice SDE underlying this process, where one can learn the drift term, for example, and this is some standard noise term there. So that one tries to learn this drift term V such that it matches the sample trajectory. So check on this sample trajectory level, one gets a reasonable approximation of this process. And this has been done in various flavors. For example, one could simply ignore the stochasticity and do DMD, operate inference Koopman-based methods, and get kind of a mean behavior model. This is course, very useful in many, many settings. But there also have been methods on NODEs and related ones for stochastic systems that try to do something more direct for these stochastic systems for the sample trajectories. And then there has been some model reduction work that assumes the knowledge of the V, but then reduces it only. Now, we try to approach it from a slightly different angle. What we say we're interested in is not necessarily these simple trajectories, but what we're really interested in is how the population moves as a whole. So what we want to understand is not so much the x t of mu, but we want to understand how the corresponding rho, you can think of it as the density, behaves over time and different physics parameters mu. And this is sufficient, if we have that, that's sufficient to draw new samples, x, that follow the same law over time and physics parameters mu. And I refer to the dynamics of rho as the population dynamics. And I will repeat this a couple of times on the next few slides. We are not approximating the Q, we're just approximating the dynamics of the Q. And this is sufficient, as I said, to generate new samples that follow the same law. And that's what I meant with understanding or predicting the behavior of the stochastic process. The population dynamics are sometimes even simpler than the dynamics of the process that generated your data. For example, if you have a fluid with a constant density, the particles that comprise the fluid can do crazy things, but on a population level, the density is constant, there's no change. So it is sometimes better, no, I shouldn't say better, it's sometimes easier to learn this population dynamics than the sample trajectories. It is meaningful in chaotic turbulent type problems on a roughly speaking, because they are meaningful in contrast to specific point evaluations. Okay, of course, learning population dynamics is very popular at this point under the umbrella term of generative modeling or generative AI. So I want to connect what we are doing a little bit to what's out there. So let's think of the rows as these trajectories over time. Each of these blue thin lines is for a different mu parameter, and this goes from time 0 to the end time t. So if you want to learn a standard denoising diffusion model that can predict these samples that have laws that follow these trajectories, we can learn a denoising diffusion model that eventually in the end gives us how to go from the noise to some row at some point time t and mu, or a sample of that. But we are not just interested at the end time and for one specific mu. What we are really interested in is the whole trajectory, right? Because it's meaningful for us. It makes physically sense how these trajectories move. And if you apply these standard denoising diffusion models, what it requires you to do is to have a separate inference step for each time point. So if you take 1,000 time steps, you need 1,000 inference steps to condition on that time t to get a sample for corresponding to each of these laws. And that might be expensive, but what's even more an issue, in my opinion, is that each of those inference steps at different times can require different hyperparameter tuning. And that can really break it if you have thousands of time steps, for example. You could do flow matching, so stochastic interpolation, so conditional flow matching. But they connect initial one with end time and don't care what happens in between. What they specifically prescribe what happens in between to get some specific things that they're interested in. And I learned that Eric van den Eyden was here just last week or this week and talked probably about the stochastic interpolation stuff. So I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong or we're doing anything better. I'm just saying we're trying to solve a different problem. What we really want is that we can generate a whole trajectory in one shot without having to do the separate inference steps. Yes.
So if I want to try to think about my original stochastic ODEs, what I want to do is to like average on all the possible realization of the noise, and then get rid of that noise in this way, right? I mean, I guess what I want to know is that what do we want to close a little bit the system such that we get rid of the stochasticity?
By looking at it in terms of the population dynamics, and that will be on the next slide, you get rid of the stochasticity. That's exactly the point. Give me next slide, and then if it's not clear, let me know. Okay, so this is what I just said, what we wanted to do. And this is what we did in this NeurIPS 2024 paper that next week will be presented, where we build on loss functions that are around, have been around for a long time, but we show that they are very challenging to train. And we make simple numerical analysis tricks to make them train better, to train with them easier in some sense. Okay, now how do we go about the population dynamics? Well, we say they follow a continuity equation, right? And this is now deterministic. On the population level, the row in time follows that continuity equation with a vector field V that can change with x time and the parameter mu. So there's no stochasticity anymore on this population level. But the interesting thing now is that, of course, this vector field is not unique. There are many different vector fields that lead to the same row dynamics. And we want to learn one of them and not specifically the one that generated the sample trajectories. That's a key thing, right? There's one V that was used to generate the data. We are not interested in that. We're interested in just one of them that has a row that follows the same dynamics as the one that we see in the data on the population level. Yes.
Is there an underlying assumption on the noise in the fact that we're able to write the population in terms of a continuity equation?
Yes, there are many assumptions here. You can not only use a continuity equation, you could use a Fokker-Planck equation type things. So there's lots of stuff going on that I'm sweeping a little bit under the rug here. Yes. Thank you. Okay, so we want to learn one V, and the V that we want to learn in the following is the one that minimizes the kinetic energy. We want to learn a V that depends on what this is an objective over T and mu for a V where this is the kinetic energy of that V. And the reason we want to do this is because that V will minimize the movement of the samples that are needed to match the corresponding row. That's a little bit the idea of why we go with this kinetic energy. So we could then just set up an optimization problem, follow the famous Benamou-Prenier paper, and just say we would like to find a V that minimizes the kinetic energy averaged over time with this constraint on the continuity equation. You then find that, well, the vector field V has to actually be a gradient field, so a grad S, and we can plug this in, and then you get these kind of optimization problems, or objectives, I should say, which are very closely related to Poisson problems. But it's not a loss at this point. It's not something we can estimate from data and train on, because it depends on the derivative of the rho in time. And we cannot estimate that from just realizations of the x. So what has then been proposed is to, I'm skipping over that. What has been proposed then is to apply integration by parts, so that the time derivative is not at the rho, but at the s. And then one gets additionally this boundary term here. And this is now a loss one can estimate from samples of x. Right? We have an expectation over rho of x from rho here, and the same here. This can be estimated from data. And these kind of loss functions have been around for a long time. So my postdoc tracked it down to the 2000 paper by Otto and Villani, where it shows up in one of the proofs. But more recently, on the machine learning side, it has been named action matching by these people here, and has been around in that setting. But this is not exactly what that's not all what we want. We additionally want to generalize over our physics parameters. So we add that again as another expectation over that we want to minimize in that loss. And here's now your comment. You can do the same for Fokker-Planck equation type things. When you have an entropy term, you regularize fixed. Yes.
When you integrate over your physical parameter, are you giving yourself any prior on the shape of the can you put some prior on the new distribution?
On the mu distribution?
The new one, I feel like the new parameter.
That is given. The new is given based on the problem that you have.
Okay.
We don't control this at where we start. It's part of the problem formulation. Good. So now this is fine. This is interesting, I think. But where now our work really came in is that we wanted to understand, why is it so hard to train this loss? It's very tricky to train this loss. And one reason could be that it is defined only up to an additive constant, and that additive constant can depend on time. So this means if we have an S plus a V plus an F, and that F is allowed to change with time, you can compute the loss of ES plus F. You get the loss of S plus this residual term. This residual term is the integral of the time derivative minus the F, and this is E of S. So in continuous setting, that's perfectly fine, and one can live with this. But as soon as you discretize, as soon as you try to empirically estimate that loss, of course, this term does not disappear anymore. And you get, in some sense, a discretization error, because the numerical quadrature, or the Monte Carlo estimate of your time derivative, is not exactly the ft plus f0. And everyone is nodding in the room and say, yeah, of course, sure, time integrate, there's a numerical error. But what's devastating in this case is that this error accumulates, it amplifies. And this is what throws the training off the track. This time-dependent constant can grow and grow and grow over atom iterations, so that the function that you actually then have to integrate in time becomes rougher and rougher and rougher. And then the training becomes unstable. So it's not only that we make our discretization error once and then we live with this, but it's actually that if we make a little bit of discretization error, it amplifies over time during the training iterations. And this is one reason that at least we try to argue in this paper, that really makes this loss to train very, very hard. Now, we have a very simple perspective on this, how to get around it to some extent. And that is to bring in a little bit more numerical analysis. What we simply say is that this additive constant makes it hard to estimate the time integral. So let's not use Monte Carlo as all the machine learners have done on this loss so far, but let's use a higher order quadrature rule. And it's a very simple trick where I think bringing in some of the numerical analysis can really have a huge impact on the corresponding training behavior. So we use Monte Carlo in space and mu, but we use higher order quadrature in time. It's simple, but it really helps to keep that growth of that constant under control. And what we then get is that we learn offline our gradient field S hat with this loss and that corresponding discretization. We get an approximate population dynamic, and then we can online or in inference phase use our grad S to draw new sample trajectories. And the key thing now is that this is the physics time that we are sampling in. It's not the artificial sampling time as in denoising diffusion models, for example. Okay. All right. So this is what I just mentioned, that we are sampling over the physics time now, not over the artificial sampling time of denoising diffusion, for example. Okay, great. So let's see some numerical experiments. And first I want to show you on a very simple oscillator problem the benefit of integrating in time more accurately with these higher order quadrature rules. This is the loss versus Adam iterations. In red, you can see Monte Carlo, and you can see it's completely unstable estimating the loss. It's a very rough behavior. And as soon as you get the time integral under control, which is what we are doing with our discretization, we get a much smoother behavior over these iterations. And this really helps to stabilize the training with this loss. Now we can apply this to cortex systems. For example, this is a 9D version of the Lorentz system, where I'm plotting here projections of dimension 2 and 7 and 4 and 6. This is the truth. This is what ours predict, and it gets especially the low probability regions reasonably right. This is AM action matching that uses Monte Carlo, and you can see it does not train. We did extensive parameter sweeps, really extensive ones. We couldn't get it to work. This is noise condition score matching and conditional flow matching. And you can see they're doing worse than ours. And I want to be careful here. I'm not claiming they cannot be doing as well as ours, but I'm saying it's very difficult to do this because you have many inference steps, and each of those inference steps potentially requires slightly different hyperparameter tuning. And we don't have the manpower to do this for 1,000 time steps or something like this. So it's a very, I think, practical issue that the accuracy here suffers because of these many different inference steps. Now we can look at a little bit more interesting Vlasov problems. So Vlasov-Poisson equation with collisions and instabilities. So this is the two-stream instability, the Bump-on-Dale instability. This is Vlasov in just 1x, 1b. This is truth, so truth meaning particle in cell method. This is ours, and you can see it kind of gets these things reasonably right. Action matching is doing reasonably well here, but it completely misses what's going on here. This is the interesting structure, I would say, as a non-plasma person. And this is denoising, and this is flow matching, which again, the inference step is a little bit more difficult. We're generalizing here over various parameters. And this is now the plot that I think is very interesting, where we're starting to have some follow-up work. What I'm showing you here is the field that we get with the particle in cell method versus our method. And when you look at it from far away, you can see, okay, on a population level, yeah, the particles are forming in a similar way as they should form. Of course, ours is an approximation, but the left one is an approximation too, but they're kind of doing reasonably the same thing. But if you look now closely, especially at the beginning, you see that the particle in cell method has a lot of movement in these particles. They are rotating quite a bit. They are flowing in and out a lot, whereas in our case, particles are much less moving around. And this is because we have the kinetic energy minimizing vector field that avoids that these particles have to do this extra stuff moving around to get the population dynamics right. We have not leveraged this at this point, but I think this is really something where one can maybe take a larger time step size or something like this and use something to even speed this up a bit more. But we have not done it in these settings here. Now, we can not only predict these fields, we can predict quantities of interest, electric energy, and we are doing reasonably well. I'm jumping over that a little bit. What I want to briefly touch on is the inference time, because this is really what we care about as reduced modeling. And then this is almost my last slide. I'm just showing you here two stream, bump on tail, 60 strong lambda damping, 90 chaos. And if you just look at the inference times, this is the standard conditional flow matching, denoising. We are orders of magnitudes faster, and at the same time, we train much better than these other methods. It really helps us a lot to speed up the inference step. And in this plot, I'm just showing you the runtime for the Vlasov problems. And let's forget let me touch on it. This is ours. This is the numerical code. You can see we get maybe 30% speed up, which is fine, but not groundbreaking, I would say. But what we really care about is the strong lambda. This is a 6D example. We are not using some made-up code. This is the Struffy code from the Max Planck Society, the IPB in Garching. It's an MPI parallelized code. It's something that they really run on a regular basis, and they have been very collaborative with us, shared lots of data, and helped us to set up these problems. And we beat it by an order of magnitude at least. So this is really something where we can reduce now this complicated stochastic with collision particle type methods in this way. With that, let me conclude. I'm out of time anyway. So I think latent dynamics is all you need for making predictions about these problems. They can be a little bit tricky to find as soon as you move out of the nice diffusion-based modeling things that have been developed over the last several decades. But I think it's an exciting area to think about nonlinear parameterizations for this, to think about stochastic cortex systems and how we can use latent dynamics there and how we can find this. So if you're interested in these works, there's this kind of survey type paper in the notices of the American Mathematical Society on this general idea of overcoming the Kolmogorov barrier. The Neural Galerkin scheme things, especially on the high dimensional side, is in a JCB paper. And then this parametric model reduction for stochastic systems is a NeurIPS paper. And I should also have listed the CoLoRA paper, which is also out there. So with that, let me thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Ben. We have some time for questions.
Just one question about the very beginning of the talk where you had the single value decomposition of the snapshot matrices. Do you have any intuition for why for a diffusive problem you get that like exponential drop off, but for a convective one?
You don't?
You don't, yeah.
I mean, there are various explanations. The one that I like best is that you really, when you have these local structures moving through the spatial domain, you have essentially orthogonal functions that are moving around. And when you look at them over the time trajectory and you want to try to approximate this in a space, you need to get every linear combination of this function. And this is what blows up the dimension.
Yeah, I was curious. So in the CoLoRA section, you mentioned AA dime at the end as an example of something that applies to these, you've applied to really large scale problems for the Michigan group, et cetera. Is there a barrier, you think, to applying CoLoRA to those type of large scale problems, or it's just something you guys haven't gotten around to yet?
So with the A-time work is a little bit older,
Yeah.
and that's why we did it in this center. On the CoLoRA side, it's in principle a similar idea, right? You adapt something low rank type-ish, but you take not only one layer, you take multiple layers of it. So I don't see a fundamental barrier, but there are certainly lots of other barriers. So the A-time did not work out of the box on the Michigan stuff, and they worked for years and years to scale it up, to parallelize it, to have all, they have Fortran codes, GEMS stuff. It's really a lot of effort to get these things working, and I don't think we will do it for CoLoRA again. But I don't see a fundamental issue why we could not do it. But the reason why we did CoLoRA is because it further brings down the latent dimension, gives us on the two examples when we compare A-time and CoLoRA more speed up. That was one of the reasons.
What are the challenges that you either see or you have encountered for the Neural Galerkin schemes with respect to like a full turbulence problem?
Oh, okay. So I think with respect to the full turbulence problem, one of the big issues is that the network needs to represent multi-scale information, and we don't get around that, right? We have exactly.
So you had an example where you did see some scale separation, but like in terms of the actual turbulence, that problem can't be overcome by this.
That method does not address that problem.
Okay. Thank you.
But I want to mention another limitation of Neural Galerkin, which is really that this gradient becomes low rank for neural networks. It's the neural collapse neural adaptation thing, or whatever that's called, co-adaptation. And we see that here as well. And we have to do things to prevent that. And what the ML people are doing is dropout. And in our case, we can do randomization, which is kind of a dropout over time. So these kind of things are starting to play a role there as well.
Okay, thank you.
Any questions? All right, let's thank Ben again for a fascinating talk.